There is a scene near the end of Breaking Bad that most people remember as a confession. Walt is sitting across from Skyler for the last time, and he finally says the thing he has been hiding for 5 seasons. He didn't cook meth for the family. He did it for himself. He liked it. He was good at it, and it made him feel alive. Most viewers treat that as the moment Heisenberg wins, the point where the transformation completes itself. But there is a different way to read that scene. It is not the end of a transformation at all. It is Walt being honest, for the first time, about who he has always been. Vince Gilligan sold Breaking Bad to AMC with one of the most memorable pitches in television history. Mr. Chips becomes Scarface, a good man broken by desperation, consumed by his worst impulses. Now that framing shaped how tens of millions of people watched the show. It is a clean, emotionally satisfying arc, and it is exactly the story the show wants you to believe it's telling. What Breaking Bad actually traces, if you are watching closely enough, is a man who was never Mr. Chips to begin with. The resentment, the ego, the desperate need to be recognized, to be feared. None of that was manufactured by a cancer diagnosis. It was already there. The cancer didn't build Heisenberg. It just gave Walt permission to stop hiding him. That is what this is about. Breaking Bad premiered on AMC on January 20th, 2008. Vince Gilligan had spent years writing and producing for The X-Files before creating the show, and the premise he brought to AMC was genuinely radical for its time. A high school chemistry teacher, Walter Hartwell White, is diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. Facing death and desperate to secure his family's financial future, he teams up with a former student, Jesse Pinkman, to cook and sell methamphetamine. Clean setup, contained, and on its surface, deeply sympathetic. The show ran for 5 seasons and 62 episodes, ending in September 2013. Modest ratings at first. By the time the finale aired, over 10 million people were watching. Verify final viewership figure. Guinness World Records certified it as the most critically acclaimed television series ever made at the time. Verify. Bryan Cranston won the Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor 4 times for the role. Verify. Understood to be 2008, 2009, 2010, and 2014. Those numbers don't fully capture what Breaking Bad did to the culture. It arrived in the golden era of prestige television anti-heroes. The Sopranos had ended in 2007. Mad Men was running in parallel. Audiences had developed a real appetite for morally complicated protagonists, and Breaking Bad fed that appetite with something more extreme than anything that had come before. What surprised Gilligan was how his audience responded. Early sympathy for Walt was understandable, a sick man with modest means and a family he wants to protect. But as the seasons progressed and Walt's choices became increasingly monstrous, a large part of the audience kept cheering. Gilligan designed the series specifically to force a moral turn, to make rooting for Walt impossible by the end. He found it was harder than he expected. Some viewers never turned at all. That resistance matters. It reveals how effectively the show had planted the transformation frame, and how deep the investment in Walt as victim ran, even as the evidence on screen was telling a different story entirely. Better Call Saul, which ran from 2015 to 2022, adds a useful lens. Created by Gilligan alongside Peter Gould, the spin-off follows Jimmy McGill's long slide into becoming Saul Goodman, and it functions in many ways as the transformation story that Breaking Bad pretends to be. Jimmy starts with real ethical instincts. He pays a documented felt cost for every compromise he makes. You can point to each step. Each loss has weight. Watching both arcs side by side sharpens the central question about Walt considerably. Jimmy McGill actually changes. Does Walter White? The case this video makes is that he doesn't. What Breaking Bad traces is a man whose ego, resentment, and need for dominance were fully formed long before a doctor delivered a terminal diagnosis. What the cancer removes is not the obstacle between Walt and Heisenberg. It removes the reason Walt had to keep Heisenberg hidden. The most undeniable evidence isn't in the crimes themselves. It's in what happened 20 years before them. Walt co-founded Gray Matter Technologies with Elliot Schwartz and Gretchen, who later became Elliot's wife. The exact circumstances of Walt's departure from the company are deliberately left vague in the show. The writers made that choice intentionally, and it works in the show's favor because the ambiguity keeps the wound open. What isn't vague at all is how Walt feels about what followed and how long he has been feeling it. The first time viewers meet Gretchen and Elliot is in season 2. Now they offer to pay for Walt's cancer treatment, quietly, through the Gray Matter Foundation. Walt accepts in the room, goes home, and then returns the money. He tells Skyler he doesn't want their charity. The scene is framed as pride. But it makes no rational sense for a man who is genuinely dying and genuinely worried about his family's future. A man who started cooking methamphetamine specifically to cover medical bills should take this check without hesitation. He doesn't. He can't. What the refusal actually is: ego. Accepting Elliot's money means acknowledging that Elliot succeeded where Walt didn't. It means Walt's actual life, the teaching job, the second job at the car wash, the modest house in Albuquerque, is evidence of failure. And Walt would rather die broke than let that be true out loud. While the resentment toward gray matter didn't start with the cancer, it predates the pilot by decades. Walt sold his stake in the company for a fraction of what it became worth, and the company went on to become worth billions. Verify. The exact sale figure is cited in the show as being nominal. The billion-dollar valuation appears in Season 2. For 20 years, he has been standing in a classroom teaching the chemistry that made someone else's fortune, and knowing it. The wound is old. It has had time to harden and deepen simultaneously, the way those wounds do when they are never addressed and never go away. This is the foundation of the always evil argument. Not the crimes, but the 20 years that precede them. The standard reading says the cancer creates the desperation that enables Walt's break from ordinary life. But if the resentment was already settled and burning long before the diagnosis, then the cancer is simply the event that removes the last reason to keep the lid on. It doesn't build the engine, it releases the brake. The craft of the show tracks this precisely, and it's worth pausing on. Walt's visual language in the early seasons is one of confinement. Tight angles, low ceilings, the chemistry classroom framed like a trap he chose. His wardrobe is aggressively beige, the color palette of a man performing mediocrity rather than living it. Bryan Cranston's physicality in those episodes carries a specific quality. Compressed, shoulders slightly forward, a man who has learned to take up less space than he believes he deserves. This isn't the design language of a character before a change. It's the design language of a character before a revelation. By Season 5, the gray matter thread gets its most explicit expression. Gretchen and Elliot appear on Charlie Rose to publicly distance themselves from the Heisenberg scandal. Walt watches the interview from a bar, and then he goes to retrieve the ricin capsule from behind an outlet plate in his abandoned house and re-enters the game one final time. Not to protect anyone. His family is already beyond his reach. He does it to make a point, to settle one last time, a score that has been running for 20 years. That's not a dying man's final act of provision. That is a grudge with a plan. The scene that defenders of the Walt was once good reading most often cite is Episode 3 of Season 1, the Crazy 8 sequence. Walt and Jesse are holding a low-level dealer named Crazy 8 chained in Jesse's basement. Walt needs to decide what to do with him, and what he does, the moment that defenders of the transformation reading point to as nearly definitive proof of Walt's original goodness, is make a list. 2 columns on a piece of paper. Reasons to let Crazy 8 live. Reasons to kill him. The Let Him Live column is full. Multiple entries, most of them variations on the same phrase, written out in slightly different ways each time. It is the morally right thing to do. The Kill Him column has a single entry. He'll murder my entire family if I don't. For many viewers, this is the clearest evidence that Walt, at this point in the story, still has a working moral compass. An evil man doesn't make the list. An evil man doesn't hesitate. Yes, the list reads as proof of genuine moral wrestling. Here's the other reading. Walt makes the list not because he is struggling with what's right, but because he is struggling with what's new. He has never been in this position before, and the body's resistance to crossing that line for the first time is not the same thing as a moral objection. Unfamiliarity is not conscience. Watch what he does next. He brings Crazy 8 food. He talks to him, finds common ground, builds something that looks like human connection. And then he discovers the shard of broken plate hidden in Crazy 8's palm, and he acts. Fast. The decision, when it finally comes, doesn't feel like a man destroying his conscience. It feels like a man clearing a practical obstacle. What follows is more revealing than what came before it. The guilt after the kill is real, and the show doesn't skip it. But the timeline is short. By the end of Season 1, Walt is walking into Tuco's operation with a bag of fulminated mercury, detonating it in a room full of people, and walking out with the money. That is not the behavior of someone whose moral structure was genuinely shattered 4 episodes earlier. That is the behavior of someone who found out what they were capable of and ran with it. The counter-argument deserves its full due. A purely sociopathic character doesn't make the list at all. The hesitation is real. The discomfort is real. These are fair observations, and they're worth sitting with. What's debatable is what that discomfort represents. Genuine moral commitment or the unfamiliarity of a man crossing a threshold he had been circling for a long time. The full arc of the series doesn't show a man whose moral structure keeps fighting Heisenberg and slowly losing ground. It shows a man who integrates Heisenberg more completely with each passing season, until the decent chemistry teacher persona becomes visibly hollow, worn by someone who outgrew it long before he took it off. If you're tracking this and you want to revisit the evidence for yourself, subscribe so you don't lose the thread. The clearest proof that Walt's arc was fixed long before the diagnosis isn't in the body count. It's in the pattern underneath every major decision. The same engine, running consistently from the first episode to the last. Recognition, control, the need to be seen as exceptional by a world that never once treated him that way. The gray matter check is the first clean example. Accepting the offer costs Walt nothing except pride. He turns it down anyway. The same engine operates in Season 4 when Gus Fring offers Walt an extraordinarily generous buyout. Retire, take the money, walk away with more than he ever imagined. Walt refuses, not because the terms are bad, because stepping away means someone else controls the outcome. And that, for Walt, is simply insupportable. This isn't rational criminal behavior, and it isn't strategic self-interest. It's the behavior of a man whose relationship to control is structural rather than situational. It predates the meth. It predates the cancer. It runs on the same fuel that had him returning Elliot's check in Season 2, a fuel that was laid down long before the show begins. The Monologue, Season 4, Episode 6. Walt stands in his own kitchen and tells Skylar, "I am the danger. I am the one who knocks." Bryan Cranston delivers it with total conviction, and it lands as one of the series' great dramatic peaks. But what is Walt actually saying? He is not describing a man defending his family. He is announcing, with audible satisfaction, that he has become the most dangerous force in the room, that the thing people fear is him. That is not someone who got in over his head. That is someone who arrived somewhere they wanted to be. Cranston's physical performance charts this across the full run of the series, and it is extraordinary craftwork. The early seasons give you a Walt who is compressed, shoulders angled forward, a man who has learned to physically take up less space than he believes he deserves. The posture of someone who has been performing smallness for a long time. By Season 5, that compression is entirely gone. Walt moves wider, more certain of his own territory, his body finally matching what his ego has always believed about him. The posture of a man who has stopped apologizing. What makes this dangerous for the argument is how well Cranston sells the arc. He gives you transformation so convincingly that it becomes easy to forget the compressed man and the expansive one are the same person, with the same engine running the whole time. The performance tracks the arc the show declares. The script tracks the continuity the argument reveals. His relationship with Jesse makes the engine visible over 5 seasons. From the pilot forward, while Walt's dynamic with Jesse exceeds anything the operational reality of their partnership requires. He belittles Jesse constantly, manipulates him, keeps him dependent in ways that serve no practical purpose. Not to sharpen Jesse's performance as a cook, because having someone beneath him is psychologically necessary for Walt in a way he never fully acknowledges. The night Walt lets Jane die is the starkest version of this. Jesse's girlfriend chokes in her sleep while Walt is standing in the room. He watches. He does nothing. The surface logic is that Jane threatened the operation. The layer beneath it, Walt cannot tolerate Jesse choosing someone else over him. Not because he needs Jesse for the business, because Walt owns Jesse in his own internal accounting. And the prospect of Jesse having something Walt didn't give him is unbearable. That's not self-preservation, that's possession. The Brock poisoning in Season 4 confirms the full architecture of this. Walt arranges for Jesse's girlfriend's young son to receive a controlled dose of a toxic plant, Lily of the Valley, in order to manipulate Jesse's loyalty at a critical moment. This plan is not desperate. There is no desperation in it at all. It is cold, precise, and operationally brilliant. It is the work of a man with total clarity about the emotional levers he is pulling and no hesitation about pulling them. A man actually transforming into this would leave marks. The grief of who he used to be would surface somewhere. Walt's version leaves no marks at all. But the Walt was once genuinely good argument deserves a full and fair hearing before it gets tested, because it isn't a weak argument. Vince Gilligan designed Breaking Bad explicitly as a transformation story. That intent is documented across years of interviews, DVD commentaries, and press. He built the season structure, the writer's room's approach, the show's entire visual grammar around the idea of a man gradually becoming someone he never was. The transformation frame is not a misreading or an accident. It is the show's declared argument built into the title, which is itself a chemistry term for a substance undergoing a fundamental change in its properties. The flashbacks support this reading. There are moments, particularly in the episode, that flashes back to Walt and Skylar's early courtship, where Walt appears warm, present, yet capable of real tenderness. The emotional specificity in those scenes is too precise to be decorative. The writers are giving you something real, and what they appear to be giving you is a version of Walt that this argument has to account for honestly. The universal capacity reading, the third option between always evil and gradual transformation, deserves acknowledgement here. The argument that Breaking Bad's deepest thesis is that everyone contains this potential, that evil is latent rather than exceptional, that an ordinary person can become this under the right circumstances, is probably closer to Gilligan's stated intent than anything else. And it's the most uncomfortable reading the show supports. If the thesis is about universal human capacity for darkness, but then calling Walt always evil actually undercuts the show's most frightening implication: you could become this. That reading has genuine weight. Here is why the evidence still tilts the other way. The "I did it for me" confession is not the language of a man who gradually lost himself. It's the language of a man who found himself and feels, in that final conversation with Skylar, the relief of no longer having to hide it. Transformation produces grief. What Walt expresses in that kitchen is release. You don't feel that kind of relief about a self you've destroyed. You feel it about a self you've finally let out. The friction that genuine transformation should produce, the cost of each step away from the person you used to be, the part of you that resists the new identity, is largely absent in Walt's arc. And he doesn't struggle against becoming Heisenberg the way Jimmy McGill struggles against becoming Saul Goodman. Walt accelerates into it. Each new capability he discovers, the willingness to threaten, to manipulate, to kill, doesn't corrupt his existing character. It matches it. Better Call Saul earns every beat of its transformation story because each of Jimmy's compromises carries a visible, felt price. You can trace what each choice costs him, almost exactly. By the time Jimmy McGill is gone and only Saul Goodman remains, you understand the full architecture of how that happened. Choice by choice, loss by loss. Walt's arc doesn't have that architecture. It has the appearance of one, in the structural logic of the seasons, in the escalating boldness of the crimes. See, but the emotional logic underneath points in one direction throughout. Not a man losing himself, but a man finding himself. The final season of Better Call Saul briefly returns Walt and Jesse to the story, and their appearance is deliberately jarring. They seem somehow smaller than you remembered, contained, slightly diminished against the moral weight that Jimmy's arc has earned. That contrast is worth sitting with. Jimmy transforms at a price you can feel. Walt arrives, and the arriving is easy. The reason the always evil reading unsettles people isn't that it's harsh, it's that it changes what the show is about. If Walt transformed, Breaking Bad is a cautionary tale, a warning about what desperation and circumstance can do to an ordinary man. The lesson is about external forces, a terrible diagnosis, financial desperation, about the wrong choices at the wrong moments. Tragic and troubling, but fundamentally about things that happen to Walt, external forces acting on an otherwise decent person. If Walt was always Heisenberg, Breaking Bad becomes something darker and more specific. It becomes the story of a society that took a man of genuine capability and paid him $43,000 a year to teach teenagers who didn't care, while the company he helped build made billionaires of everyone around him. Verify Walt's salary figure. The show references it, but I want to confirm the exact figure cited. The long, detailed record of Walt being overlooked, underpaid, and dismissed becomes not the cause of his fall, but the context of his emergence. That reading is harder to live with because it asks questions about what we reward and what we waste. It asks about the Walts who never get a diagnosis, who just keep showing up, keep performing the contained, respectable, good enough life indefinitely. It asks whether the social arrangement that keeps most people decent is a moral achievement or just a contract that hasn't been tested yet. Walt was good enough. A good enough husband, a good enough father, a good enough teacher. And good enough was the wound. Not failure, not obvious defeat, just the slow, grinding weight of a life that never matched what he believed he deserved, carried quietly for decades, until the diagnosis made the pretending pointless. When the world finally gave him room to be exactly what he was, he didn't struggle. He didn't fight it. He felt alive. Breaking Bad is one of the most precisely constructed television series ever made. Every choice, be from the color language of Walt's wardrobe to the way the camera lingers on his face during moments of violence, is intentional. Vince Gilligan built a machine. The most remarkable thing about that machine is how effectively it conceals its own argument. The show tells you it's a transformation story, delivers every structural signal of a transformation story, and earned enormous critical recognition on that exact basis. But the evidence embedded in the show points somewhere else. The gray matter wound, 20 years old before the pilot begins. The Crazy Eight list, more revealing of unfamiliarity than genuine moral struggle. The ego engine running beneath every major decision, consistently overriding rational exits every time one presents itself. The I did it for me confession, landing not as breakdown, but as autobiography. Of the complete absence of the friction that real transformation produces. Walt wasn't broken by the world, he was hidden by it. The teaching job, the modest house, the careful performance of a respectable life. These weren't expressions of who Walt was. They were the covering. Once the cancer removed the reason to maintain the performance, the show didn't have to build a new character. It uncovered the one who was already there. That makes Walt a more frightening figure than the transformation reading allows. A man who falls from goodness is, in some way, exceptional because he had something worth losing. But a man who was always this, who simply never had the right stage for it, that's a different kind of warning altogether. Because the question he raises isn't how did a good man fall? The question he raises is how many people are out there, right now, performing lives they don't believe in, waiting for the circumstances that would finally let them stop. Breaking Bad's cultural legacy is built on the premise of the transformation. That's what won it the awards. That's what made it the subject of think pieces and university courses and podcast episodes. The Mr. Chips to Scarface arc is clean and teachable and morally coherent. It's the story the show declared. But the deeper legacy, the thing that still unsettles you years after the credits roll, is something else entirely. It's the suspicion that builds across 5 seasons and gets confirmed in one quiet kitchen conversation. You were never watching a transformation. You were watching a revelation. And the man being revealed was right there, in that beige classroom, in that cramped house, in that compressed and careful performance of a decent life, the whole time. Walt told Skyler he liked it, was good at it, and felt more alive than he had ever felt before. That's not a confession, that's biography. Go back and watch the pilot with that in mind. Watch Cranston hold Walt's body in those early scenes, the restraint, the controlled smallness of a man who has learned to take up less space than he believes he deserves. Watch how he reacts when his students dismiss him, when Hank talks over him, when the whole social world around him reflects back the image of a man who is fine, nothing more. The performance is impeccable, but the character is right there underneath it. Has been the whole time. If there's a scene that reads differently to you, something that still lands as genuine transformation rather than revelation, drop it in the comments. The best Breaking Bad arguments live in the details. I want to know which one you'd put up against this reading.